The dress blues hung in my closet like a ghost from another life. Pristine, untouched, gathering dust for 15 years. My father's words echoed every time I glimpsed that navy fabric through the crack in the door. "You'll never wear that uniform again, Rebecca. Not after what you've done." He was wrong about a lot of things, but I never imagined how spectacularly wrong he'd be about this. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The morning everything changed, like any other Tuesday in my cramped Chicago apartment. Coffee brewing, news droning in the background. Another day at Morrison & Associates where I pushed paper and pretended my economics degree from Northwestern meant something. But when my phone buzzed with a call from an unknown DC number, I knew my carefully constructed ordinary life was about to crumble. "Ms. Rebecca Chen?" The voice was crisp, official. "This is Colonel Martinez from the Department of Defense. We need to discuss your military service record." My hand trembled as I set down my coffee mug. 15 years. 15 years since I'd walked away from everything I'd ever wanted, everything I'd trained for, everything that had defined me since I was 17 years old and desperate to prove myself to a father who saw weakness where others saw determination. "There must be some mistake," I managed. "My service ended in 2009. Ma'am, I'm aware of the circumstances surrounding your departure. However, recent developments require your immediate attention. Can you be in Washington by Thursday?" I stared at my reflection on the black computer screen. 38 years old, wearing a wrinkled blouse and yesterday's mascara, looking nothing like the young lieutenant who'd once commanded respect from soldiers twice her age. The woman who'd been destined for greatness before one split-second decision destroyed everything. Growing up in Sacramento, I'd been the daughter who couldn't sit still. While my older brother David excelled at violin and advanced calculus, I was scaling the neighbor's fence, organizing elaborate games of capture the flag, and studying military history with an intensity that worried my traditional Chinese-American parents. My mother, Dr. Helen Chen, wanted me to follow her path into medicine. My father, Professor James Chen, envisioned me in academia, safely contained within university walls where intellect mattered more than physical courage. "Military service is not for Chen women," he'd declared when I announced my acceptance to West Point. "You think this is some game, Rebecca? You think they'll see your determination and overlook your size, your gender, your inexperience with real hardship?" But I'd proven him wrong, hadn't I? 4 years at the academy, graduating in the top 10% of my class. Ranger School at 22, one of only 3 women in my cohort to complete the program. Jump wings, combat leadership courses, deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan where I'd led mixed-gender units through operations that would have broken weaker soldiers. My father never acknowledged any of it. Not the commendations, not the Purple Heart from the IED that nearly killed me outside Kandahar, not the Bronze Star for the night I'd carried 2 wounded soldiers to safety under enemy fire. In his mind, I was still the stubborn little girl playing soldier, destined to fail when reality hit. The reality that eventually did hit came in the form of Lieutenant Colonel Richardson, my commanding officer, during my final deployment. A man who believed women belonged in support roles, not leading combat missions. A man whose wandering hands and late-night mentoring sessions had made my life hell for 8 months. The night I finally snapped, the night I put Richardson in the hospital with a broken jaw and 3 cracked ribs, was the night my military career died. Self-defense, they called it. Justified use of force. But Richardson had connections, had political capital, had the ability to make my life so miserable that staying meant abandoning every principle I'd ever held. So I walked away, resigned my commission, packed my dress blues in a garment bag I swore I'd never open again, and spent 15 years trying to forget the woman I used to be. "Miss Chen?" Colonel Martinez's voice pulled me back to the present. "Are you still there?" "I'm here." The words felt foreign in my mouth. For 15 years, I'd been Becca, the quiet analyst who kept her head down and her opinions to herself. Rebecca Chen, former Army officer, had been buried so deep I'd almost convinced myself she'd never existed. "Ma'am, what I'm about to tell you is classified." In 2018, a congressional investigation into military sexual assault cases was launched. Lieutenant Colonel Richardson's conduct during multiple deployments has come to light. Your case, along with 17 others, has been reviewed by a special panel. My legs gave out. I sank into my desk chair, gripping the phone with white knuckles. The panel's findings were clear, Ms. Chen. Your resignation was accepted under false pretenses. You were the victim of systematic harassment and retaliation. The Army owes you an apology, and more than that, we owe you justice. Justice. The word tasted bitter. What was justice after 15 years of exile? After watching my dreams crumble while Richardson continued his career, eventually retiring as a full colonel with full honors? There's more, Martinez continued. Your personnel file has been reviewed by the promotion board. Based on your performance records, your leadership evaluations, and the circumstances of your departure, you've been selected for immediate reinstatement and promotion. Promotion? I barely whispered the word. Ma'am, effective immediately, you're being recalled to active duty with the rank of Brigadier General, 1 star, Ms. Chen, with an assignment to head the new Military Justice Reform Division at the Pentagon. The room spun. Brigadier General, 1 star. After 15 years of believing I'd thrown away my entire future for one moment of justified rage, they were offering me back everything I'd lost, and more. But that wasn't the end of it. General Chen, Martinez continued, using my new rank like it was the most natural thing in the world, there's one more thing. Your father, Professor James Chen, is scheduled to receive the Department of Defense's highest civilian honor next month for his contributions to military logistics research. The ceremony will be at the Pentagon. As the senior officer in charge of the event, you'll be presenting the award. I hung up the phone and sat in the silence of my ordinary apartment, staring at the closet where my dress blues waited in their garment bag. My father, who'd spent his entire life telling me I'd never be good enough, never be strong enough, never be worthy of the uniform I dreamed of wearing since childhood, was about to receive an award from his daughter's hands. His daughter, the general, the woman he'd said would never wear that uniform again, was about to walk into the Pentagon wearing a single star, with the power to change everything he'd told her was impossible. But first, I had to figure out if I was brave enough to become Rebecca Chen again. 3 days later, I stood in the Pentagon's main lobby at 0600 hours, my civilian clothes feeling foreign as uniformed personnel moved past me with purpose I hadn't felt in 15 years. The building hummed with an energy I'd forgotten existed. The electricity of being part of something larger than yourself, something that mattered. Colonel Martinez appeared precisely on time, a compact woman with silver threading through her black hair and eyes that missed nothing. General Chen, she said, extending her hand. Welcome back. Quote, General Chen. The title still felt like wearing someone else's shoes, but Martinez said it with such matter-of-fact confidence that, for a moment, I almost believed it myself. Before we discuss your new position, there's someone who wants to meet you, she said, leading me toward the elevators. Secretary Harrison has been personally involved in your case. The elevator rose past floors I'd only dreamed of accessing as a junior officer. When the doors opened on the executive level, I felt my breath catch. This was where policy was made, where decisions that affected millions of lives were discussed over morning coffee. Secretary of Defense Patricia Harrison was smaller than she appeared on television, but her presence filled the conference room. She stood as we entered, dismissing the 2 aides, flanking her with a subtle nod. Ms. Chen, she said, then corrected herself with a slight smile. General Chen, thank you for coming. We sat across from each other at a mahogany table that had probably witnessed decades of crucial decisions. Harrison opened a thick file folder, and I caught glimpses of my old performance reports, commendation letters, and photographs from deployments that felt like another lifetime. I've read everything, she said. Your record from West Point, through your resignation, the investigation reports. Richardson's subsequent behavior patterns with other female officers. The panel's unanimous findings. She closed the folder and looked directly at me. We failed you, General. The system failed you, and I personally want to ensure that never happens again. The words I'd waited 15 years to hear felt hollow now. Where had this concern been when I was 29 years old and facing the choice between my dignity and my career? Richardson? I asked. Forced retirement last year when the investigation concluded. Loss of pension. Dishonorable discharge. It's not enough, but it's what the law allows. Harrison's expression hardened. Your case became the catalyst for systemic changes we should have implemented decades ago. She pulled out another folder, thinner than the first. Your new assignment. The Military Justice Reform Division is being established to prevent what happened to you from happening to anyone else. You'll have a staff of 50, direct reporting authority to me, and the mandate to overhaul how we handle sexual assault and harassment cases. I stared at the organizational chart she'd placed before me. My name at the top, lines connecting to departments and personnel I'd be responsible for leading. It was more authority than I'd ever imagined holding, a chance to protect future generations of service members from the corruption that had destroyed my first military life. There's one more thing, Harrison continued. Your promotion isn't stopping at 1 star. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. I looked up sharply. The reforms you'll be implementing require significant institutional weight behind them. Congress has approved your immediate promotion to Major General upon assumption of duties. 2 stars, General Chen. 2 stars, Major General. At 38, I'd be one of the youngest female generals in Army history. The girl my father had dismissed as too small, too stubborn, too unrealistic, was being handed power that would have been unimaginable during my first military career. The meeting concluded with paperwork, security clearances, and a schedule that would consume the next month of my life. As I walked back through the Pentagon's corridors, everything looked different. These weren't hallowed halls I could only observe from a distance. They were my workplace now. That evening, I called my brother David from my hotel room. He'd become a successful surgeon in Seattle, following the path our parents had always envisioned for both of us. We'd stayed close despite the geographic distance and my self-imposed exile from family discussions about my failed military career. 2 stars? His voice carried disbelief and pride in equal measure. Rebecca, do you understand what this means? I'm starting to, I admitted, staring at the dress uniform hanging in my hotel closet. The tailor had worked miracles that afternoon, adjusting measurements and adding the appropriate insignia. Tomorrow would be my first day as Major General Chen, and I still wasn't sure I deserved the title. Have you told Mom and Dad? The question I'd been dreading. Not yet. You have to tell them, Rebecca, especially Dad. He needs to know. My father, Professor James Chen, whose upcoming award ceremony had become the backdrop for the most complicated family reunion in history. He still didn't know about my recall to active duty, still believed his youngest daughter was wasting her life in corporate obscurity. He's still Dad, David continued gently, still the man who taught us to value achievement and honor academic excellence above everything else. But maybe it's time he learned there are other kinds of excellence. After we hung up, I called my parents' house in Sacramento. My mother answered, her voice warm with surprise at hearing from me on a weeknight. Rebecca, how wonderful! Your father and I were just discussing his upcoming trip to Washington. He's very excited about the ceremony. Mom, I need to tell you both something. Is Dad available? Quote. Minutes later, both my parents were on the phone, my father's skeptical silence filling the gaps between my mother's excited interjections as I explained the situation. The recall to active duty. The promotion. The new position. The fact that I'd be the one presenting his award. When I finished, the silence stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, my father spoke. Major General? Yes, Dad. You're certain this isn't some mistake? Some administrative error? There it was. Even faced with indisputable evidence of my success, his first instinct was to question whether I'd truly earned it. Some things never changed. It's not a mistake, I said quietly. The ceremony is in 3 weeks. I'll be presenting your award in my dress uniform. Another long pause. Then, I suppose we'll see you there. The call ended without congratulations, without acknowledgement of what this meant, without any indication that he understood his daughter had just achieved something extraordinary. But I hadn't expected anything different. My father's approval had never been freely given, and I'd stopped seeking it years ago. What mattered now wasn't his validation. What mattered was the work ahead. The chance to protect other service members from the corruption that had nearly destroyed me. The opportunity to prove that sometimes the system could correct its own failures, even if justice came 15 years too late. That night, I tried on my dress uniform for the first time in over a decade. The fabric felt heavier than I remembered, weighted with responsibility and possibility in equal measure. The 2 stars on my shoulders caught the hotel room's lamplight, a reminder that sometimes the most impossible dreams have a way of reshaping themselves into reality. In 3 weeks, I'd walk into that Pentagon ceremony room wearing these stars, carrying the authority to change everything my father had told me was beyond my reach. The daughter he'd said would never wear the uniform again was about to prove him wrong in the most public way possible. But first, I had a division to build, a mission to accomplish, and a version of myself to resurrect from 15 years of carefully maintained obscurity. The Military Justice Reform Division occupied an entire floor of the Pentagon's B Ring, a space that had been hastily converted from storage and administrative offices into something resembling a functioning headquarters. Boxes of case files lined the walls, evidence of decades of systemic failure that now fell under my responsibility to address. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Washington, my newly assigned deputy, briefed me on our first week's priorities as we walked through the maze of cubicles and temporary workstations. A former military prosecutor with 15 years of experience in sexual assault cases, she possessed the institutional knowledge I'd need to navigate the political landmines ahead. "We've got 3 congressional hearings scheduled for next month," she explained, handing me a folder thick with testimony preparation materials. "Senator Phillips from Armed Services wants detailed statistics on case outcomes. Representative Martinez from the House Committee is pushing for timeline commitments on policy implementation." I flipped through the documents, each page representing lives disrupted, careers ended, justice delayed or denied entirely. The scope of what we were attempting felt overwhelming. Not just changing policies, but transforming a culture that had protected predators for generations. "What about resistance?" I asked. "How many senior officers are actively working against what we're doing here?" Washington's expression tightened. "More than you'd expect. Fewer than we feared. Richardson had allies, people who benefited from the old system of looking the other way. But your appointment sent a clear message from the top. Most of them are keeping quiet, waiting to see if this is real reform or just political theater." The weight of proof fell on my shoulders. Every decision I made, every policy I implemented, every public statement I gave would be scrutinized for evidence that a woman could lead institutional change at this level. It wasn't just about justice for past victims. It was about demonstrating that the military could evolve. My days blurred together in a rhythm I'd forgotten existed. Morning briefings at 0630, staff meetings, congressional liaisons, policy drafts, budget reviews, and endless phone calls, with commanders who needed convincing that change was both necessary and inevitable. The 15 years I'd spent in corporate limbo had taught me patience and strategy, skills that proved invaluable when dealing with bureaucratic resistance. But it was the survivor interviews that kept me grounded in why this work mattered. Every Tuesday, I met with service members who'd been through the broken system we were trying to fix. Their stories varied in details but followed depressingly similar patterns. Reporting mechanisms that failed, investigations that stalled, retaliation that ended careers, justice that never came. Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez had been assaulted by her platoon sergeant during a deployment to Kuwait. When she reported it, she was transferred to a different unit and given performance evaluations that effectively ended her promotion prospects. Petty Officer James Kim had faced sexual harassment from a superior officer for months before finally coming forward, only to watch his harasser receive a reprimand and transfer to a better assignment. Captain Lisa Thompson had been drugged at a unit party and assaulted by 2 fellow officers who were never charged due to, quote, insufficient evidence. Each story reinforced my determination to ensure the system I was building would be different, better, worthy of the trust these survivors had placed in us by sharing their experiences. The irony wasn't lost on me that while I was fighting to protect other people's military careers, my own father still hadn't acknowledged what I'd achieved. 2 weeks had passed since our phone conversation, and he hadn't called once to ask about my new position or express pride in my promotion. My mother had called 3 times, excited about seeing me in uniform again, but my father's silence spoke volumes. David called me on a Friday evening as I was leaving the office, catching me in the Pentagon parking garage where my voice echoed off concrete walls. "He's struggling with it," David said without preamble. "Mom says he's been reading everything he can find about your new position, printing out articles from military publications, studying organizational charts like he's preparing for a dissertation defense." "That sounds like Dad," I admitted, searching for my car keys in the darkness. "Treating my career like an academic puzzle to solve." "It's more than that, Rebecca. I think he's realizing how wrong he was about your potential. He spent 30 years telling you the military would never value what you had to offer, and now you're in charge of changing the entire institution. That's gotta be difficult for someone who stakes his identity on being right about everything." The parking garage's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the rows of government vehicles. Somewhere in this maze of bureaucracy and protocol, I was trying to rebuild not just military justice systems, but also my own relationship with the career I'd thought was lost forever. "The ceremony is next week," I said. "Has he mentioned anything about it?" "He asked Mom to have his dress shirt pressed twice. He's nervous, Rebecca. More nervous than I've ever seen him before a professional event." Professor James Chen, nervous. The man who'd delivered lectures to auditoriums full of military officers, who'd consulted for defense contractors, who'd never shown uncertainty about anything in his professional life, was anxious about receiving an award from his daughter. That weekend, I drove to Quantico to visit the National Museum of the Marine Corps, needing space to think outside the Pentagon's walls. Walking through exhibits about military leadership and sacrifice, I found myself studying the photographs of generals who'd shaped American military history. Most were men, most were white, most had followed traditional career paths that never included the detours I'd taken. But scattered among them were the outliers. Officers who'd faced discrimination, who'd been underestimated, who'd proven their worth through excellence rather than expectation. General Ann Dunwoody, the first female four-star general. General Patricia Horoho, who'd revolutionized military medicine. Lieutenant General Nadja West, who'd overcome racial barriers to reach the Army's highest medical position. I wasn't the first woman to wear stars on her uniform, but I was among the first to earn them after losing them. The path I'd walked, from decorated officer to corporate exile to institutional reformer, wasn't traditional, but maybe that unconventional journey was exactly what the position required. Monday morning brought new challenges. A conservative senator had scheduled a hearing to question whether someone with my background should be leading military reforms. The implication was clear. A woman who'd resigned under controversial circumstances, regardless of the circumstances themselves, might not have the moral authority to judge others. Lieutenant Colonel Washington walked into my office with a stack of talking points prepared by the Pentagon's public affairs team. "They want you to emphasize your qualifications, downplay the personal aspects of your resignation, and focus on policy specifics." I read through the sanitized version of my story they'd prepared. It transformed my experience from a narrative about institutional failure and personal courage into bullet points about career progression and professional development. The woman who'd stood up to harassment and paid the price for 15 years had been edited out completely. "No," I said, handing the papers back to Washington. "If they want to question my background, let's talk about my background, all of it." The hearing was scheduled for Thursday, 2 days before my father's award ceremony. The timing felt deliberate, designed to undermine my credibility just before the most public moment of my career. But maybe it was also an opportunity, a chance to demonstrate that the military's new approach to justice would be led by someone who understood both the cost of speaking the truth and the price of staying silent. As I prepared my testimony, I realized that everything, the promotion, the position, the upcoming ceremony, even my father's recognition, had led to this moment. The question wasn't whether I deserved to wear the uniform again. The question was whether I was ready to use the authority it represented to protect others the way no one had protected me. The Hart Senate office building buzzed with morning activity as I made my way to Committee Room 216, my dress uniform drawing curious glances from staffers and lobbyists who populated the hallways. Lieutenant Colonel Washington walked beside me, carrying a briefcase full of statistics and policy documents that might not matter if the hearing went badly. Senator Robert Kensington of Alabama waited behind the committee table, flanked by two colleagues whose stone-faced expressions suggested this wouldn't be a friendly conversation. Kensington had built his political career on traditional military values and skepticism of what he called social engineering in the armed forces. My appointment represented everything he opposed. General Chen, Kensington began once the formalities concluded, you resigned from active duty under what some might call questionable circumstances. You physically assaulted a superior officer, causing significant injuries. How do we reconcile that history with your current position overseeing military justice? The question I'd prepared for, but hearing it spoken aloud in this marble column chamber still felt like a punch to the stomach. Around the room, reporters scribbled notes while cameras captured my response for evening news broadcasts. Senator, I defended myself against sexual assault, I replied, keeping my voice steady. Lieutenant Colonel Richardson's subsequent investigation and forced retirement validated the circumstances that led to my resignation. But you didn't go through proper channels, did you? Kensington pressed. You didn't file reports, seek mediation, or follow established procedures. You responded with violence. This was the trap. Admit that the system had failed me, and they'd question my faith in military justice. Defend my actions, and they'd paint me as someone who couldn't follow rules. I thought about all the survivors I'd interviewed, all the women and men who'd tried those proper channels, only to watch their careers end while their attackers prospered. Senator, I did file reports. 3 separate incidents over 8 months, all documented in my personnel file. I requested transfers twice, both denied. I attended mandatory counseling sessions, where I was told to be more understanding of the pressures combat commanders face. The proper channels failed not just me, but 17 other service members who experienced similar treatment from the same officer. Senator Martinez, the only woman on the committee, leaned forward. General Chen, can you elaborate on what happened to those other cases? Many of the victims left military service rather than continue fighting a system that protected their attackers. Others suffered retaliation that effectively ended their careers. 2 attempted suicide. The system I'm working to reform wasn't broken. It was working exactly as designed to protect the institution at the expense of individual service members. The room fell silent except for the clicking of camera shutters. I'd said more than my handlers wanted, revealed more vulnerability than political wisdom suggested. But I was tired of sanitized versions of the truth. Senator Williams from Vermont, the committee's ranking member, consulted his notes. General, you've been in your current position for 3 weeks. What concrete changes have you implemented? This was safer ground. I outlined the new reporting protocols, the independent investigation teams, the victim advocacy programs, and the training requirements for all personnel. The statistics were encouraging. Reports were up 40% since word of the new system had spread, suggesting that service members finally believed their complaints would be taken seriously. But these are just procedural changes, Kensington interjected. How do we know this isn't just another bureaucratic shuffle that looks good on paper but changes nothing in practice? The question hung in the air like a challenge. How do you prove transformation to people invested in maintaining the status quo? How do you demonstrate that institutions can change when every example of failure reinforces their skepticism? Senator, last week a junior enlisted soldier reported sexual harassment by her squad leader. Under the old system, that report would have gone to the squad leader's commanding officer, who happened to be his golf partner and drinking buddy. The investigation would have been cursory, the victim would have faced retaliation, and nothing would have changed. I pulled out a folder from my briefcase, breaking protocol but past caring about political niceties. Under our new system, that report went directly to an independent investigation team, with no connection to the accused's chain of command. The investigation was completed in 72 hours with video evidence and witness testimony. The squad leader has been removed from his position and faces court-martial. The victim remains in her unit with full command support and protection from retaliation. The folder contained photos of both soldiers, the young woman who'd found courage to speak up, the man whose career had ended because someone finally listened to his victims. I didn't show the photos, but their weight in my hands reminded me why political theater mattered less than actual results. The hearing continued for another hour, covering budget allocations, staffing requirements, and implementation timelines. But the real moment had passed. The point where I'd chosen truth over political safety, substance over strategy. Walking out of the Hart Building, Washington shook her head with a mixture of admiration and concern. That was either brilliant or career suicide, General, maybe both. If being honest about why this work matters ends my career, then it wasn't worth having, I replied, surprising myself with how much I meant it. The afternoon brought unexpected news. Secretary Harrison called personally to debrief the hearing, but instead of criticism, she offered support. I watched the live stream, she said. You did exactly what I hoped you'd do when I recommended you for this position. The Pentagon needs leaders willing to tell uncomfortable truths, not politicians in uniform. Quote, that evening, my mother called from Sacramento, her voice bubbling with excitement about the next day's ceremony. She'd watched the hearing coverage on C-SPAN and wanted to talk about everything. My testimony, my uniform, the weight of representing both our family and military reform. Your father watched too, she mentioned near the end of our conversation. He didn't say much afterward, but he asked me to record it so he could watch again. Professor James Chen, recording congressional hearings featuring his daughter, the man who dismissed my military ambitions as unrealistic fantasies, was now studying my public testimony like source material for academic research. Is he nervous about tomorrow? I asked. Terrified, my mother admitted with a laugh. He's been practicing his acceptance speech in front of the bathroom mirror. I think he's more worried about embarrassing you than you are about embarrassing him. After we hung up, I sat in my Pentagon office reviewing the ceremony protocol one final time. Tomorrow, I'd present the Department of Defense's highest civilian honor to the man who'd spent 30 years telling me I'd never be worthy of military recognition. The symmetry felt almost scripted, like a novelist's attempt at poetic justice. But life rarely provided such neat resolutions. My father's recognition was legitimate. His research on supply chain logistics had saved countless military lives and billions in taxpayer dollars. His daughter presenting the award was coincidence, not cosmic justice. What mattered wasn't the symbolic victory of proving my father wrong. What mattered was the work itself, the survivors who now had advocates, the policies that might prevent future victims, the culture slowly shifting toward accountability. The dress uniform hanging in my office closet represented more than vindication or family drama. It represented responsibility, authority, and the chance to ensure that other young officers would never face the choice between their dignity and their dreams. Tomorrow's ceremony would be televised, covered by military publications and mainstream media alike. Major General Rebecca Chen, presenting an award to her father while wearing the uniform he'd said she'd never wear again. The headlines would write themselves. But tonight, I had reports to review, policies to finalize, and a speech to practice. The real work happened between ceremonies, in committee rooms, and survivor interviews, and late-night policy sessions that would never make the news. The Pentagon's ceremonial hall gleamed under television lights as camera crews finished their setup. Rows of chairs filled with defense contractors, congressional staffers, and military officials created a sea of dark suits and dress uniforms. At the podium, technicians tested microphones while photographers claimed positions for the moment when Major General Rebecca Chen would present the Distinguished Public Service Award to Professor James Chen. I stood in the adjacent preparation room, adjusting my dress uniform one final time. The 2 stars on my shoulders caught the fluorescent light, each one representing battles fought and won, respect earned through years of dedication that had nearly been lost forever. Lieutenant Colonel Washington performed a final inspection, ensuring every ribbon was perfectly aligned, every crease razor sharp. 5 minutes, General, an aide announced through the door. Through the preparation room's small window, I could see my parents taking their seats in the front row. My father wore his best suit, the one reserved for dissertation defenses and faculty awards dinners. His usually confident posture seemed diminished, shoulders slightly hunched, as if the weight of the occasion pressed down on him. My mother sat beside him, radiant with pride, occasionally touching his arm in reassurance. David had flown in from Seattle that morning, sitting with his wife and 2 children who'd never seen their aunt in uniform. The sight of my family gathered for a military ceremony, something my father had once declared impossible, felt surreal. Secretary Harrison entered the preparation room, her presence commanding even in the small space. "Ready, Rebecca?" The use of my first name, rare in our professional interactions, acknowledged that this moment transcended typical military protocol. This was personal as much as professional, family drama playing out on the Pentagon's most public stage. "I've been ready for 15 years, I replied, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. We walked through corridors lined with portraits of defense secretaries and military leaders, each face representing decades of institutional tradition I was now part of reshaping. The ceremonial hall's double doors opened, and I stepped into the bright lights and focused the attention of the assembled dignitaries. The ceremony began with the national anthem, my hand moving instinctively to my heart as voices filled the vast space. Standing at attention, I felt the familiar comfort of military ritual, the sense of belonging I'd thought lost forever. When the music ended, Secretary Harrison approached the podium. "Ladies and gentlemen, we gather today to recognize exceptional civilian contributions to national defense," she began, her voice carrying easily through the hall's acoustics. "The Distinguished Public Service Award represents the highest honor we can bestow upon those outside the military who have dedicated their expertise to protecting our nation." She outlined my father's achievements, 3 decades of research into supply chain optimization, innovations that had revolutionized military logistics, consulting work that had saved both lives and resources across multiple conflicts. The accomplishments were impressive, worthy of recognition regardless of our family relationship. Professor Chen's work has been instrumental in ensuring our forces receive critical supplies faster, more efficiently, and at lower cost than ever before. His algorithms have been implemented across all service branches. His training protocols have educated thousands of logistics officers, and his research continues to drive innovation in military procurement. I listened to the recitation of my father's career with newfound appreciation. While I'd been focused on my own military aspirations, he'd been contributing to national defense in ways I'd never fully understood. His criticism of my chosen path hadn't stemmed from dismissal of military service itself, but from his belief that intellectual contributions mattered more than physical ones. "Today's presentation holds special significance," Harrison continued, glancing toward me. "Professor Chen's award will be presented by Major General Rebecca Chen, his daughter, who currently leads our Military Justice Reform Division. General Chen's own distinguished career exemplifies the excellence and dedication that characterize both our honored recipient and our presenting officer." The words felt like vindication, but looking at my father's face, I saw something more complex than pride or acknowledgement. He looked overwhelmed, perhaps realizing for the first time that his daughter had achieved the very success he'd predicted was impossible. "General Chen, please join me at the podium." Quote, I walked across the stage, each step measured and deliberate, aware that cameras were capturing every moment for posterity. The 2 stars on my shoulders felt weightless now, no longer symbols of improbable achievement but simple indicators of earned authority. Secretary Harrison handed me the award, a heavy crystal piece engraved with the Defense Department's seal and my father's name. The weight of it reminded me of similar ceremonies I'd attended as a junior officer, watching senior leaders recognize achievements I'd hoped to earn myself someday. "Professor James Chen," I announced, my voice carrying across the silent hall, "please join me on stage." My father rose from his seat with careful dignity, walking toward the stage with steps that seemed both proud and uncertain. As he climbed the stairs, I saw him not as the intimidating academic who'd shaped my childhood, but as an aging man receiving recognition for life's work from the daughter he'd never quite understood. We stood facing each other on the Pentagon's most formal stage, separated by 3 feet of space that represented decades of misunderstanding, missed connections, and fundamental disagreements about what constituted worthy achievement. The moment stretched beyond its scripted duration as we looked at each other. Father and daughter, professor and general, 2 people who'd traveled very different paths to this shared recognition. "Professor Chen," I began, following the ceremony's official script but adding words that weren't written anywhere, "your contributions to national defense represent the highest ideals of civilian service. Your research has protected countless service members, improved military effectiveness, and demonstrated that there are many ways to serve one's country with honor." I handed him the award, our fingers briefly touching as he accepted it. In that contact, I felt something shift. Not complete understanding, perhaps, but acknowledgement of mutual respect earned through different forms of excellence. Your dedication to improving military logistics has made every deployment safer, every mission more likely to succeed, and every service member better equipped to accomplish their duties. On behalf of the Department of Defense and the grateful nation you've served, I present you with the Distinguished Public Service Award. Quote, the hall erupted in applause as my father accepted the Crystal Award, holding it with the careful reverence of someone who understood its significance. But instead of turning to acknowledge the audience, he remained facing me, his eyes bright with unshed tears. General Chen, he said quietly, using my rank for the first time, I owe you an apology. The words weren't part of any script, weren't intended for the microphones or cameras capturing our interaction. They were meant for me alone, a father's acknowledgement that he'd been wrong about his daughter's potential. Dad, I began, but he continued. I told you that uniform would never fit, that the military would never value what you had to offer. I was wrong about everything. His voice strengthened, carrying now to the microphones and beyond. You've not only earned the right to wear those stars, you've used them to make the entire institution better. I couldn't be more proud of the officer and leader you've become. The applause continued, but I barely heard it. After 38 years, my father had finally seen me not as the stubborn child playing soldier, but as the woman who'd transformed her dreams into institutional change. We embraced briefly, awkwardly, two people learning to navigate a relationship forever changed by this moment of mutual recognition. When we separated, I saw my mother in the front row, tears streaming down her face as she witnessed her family's reconciliation. As the ceremony concluded and guests moved toward the reception, I remained on stage for a moment, looking out at the assembled crowd. Among them were survivors I'd interviewed, congressional staffers who'd questioned my qualifications, Pentagon officials who'd doubted whether real reform was possible. They were all here to witness not just my father's recognition, but the proof that sometimes institutions could change, that sometimes justice came late but still arrived, that sometimes the uniform dismissed as impossible to wear again could carry the authority to transform everything. The dress blues that had hung in my closet for 15 years, gathering dust and memories of failure, now carried 2 stars, and the responsibility to ensure no other service member would face the choice between dignity and dreams. My father had been wrong about many things, but he'd been right about one. I would never wear that uniform the same way again. I wore it better now, with the authority earned through survival, the wisdom gained through exile, and the purpose discovered through the chance to protect others. The little girl who dreamed of wearing stars had finally grown into the general who could make those stars mean something. 6 months after the ceremony that changed everything, I stood in the Oval Office as President Martinez signed the Military Justice Reform Act into law. The legislation codified every policy change we'd implemented, transforming experimental programs into permanent institutional structures that would outlast any single administration or leadership change. General Chen, the president said as cameras flashed around us, this represents the most comprehensive reform of military justice in 50 years. Your division's work has set the standard for how institutions should respond to systemic failure. The signing ceremony felt surreal after months of congressional hearings, budget battles, and bureaucratic negotiations. What had started as personal vindication had evolved into something larger, a fundamental shift in how the military approached accountability and victim protection. Lieutenant Colonel Washington, now promoted to full colonel and deputy director of our expanded division, stood among the assembled officials. Our staff had grown to over 200 personnel across 3 Pentagon floors, with satellite offices at major military installations worldwide. The experimental program had become a permanent fixture of military operations. But the real measure of success wasn't ceremonial moments or organizational charts. It was the numbers that arrived on my desk each Monday morning. Reports submitted, investigations completed, perpetrators prosecuted, victims protected. In 6 months, we'd processed more sexual assault cases than the previous system had handled properly in 6 years. More importantly, the culture was shifting. Command climate surveys showed increasing confidence in reporting mechanisms. Anonymous feedback indicated that service members finally believed their complaints would be taken seriously. The whisper networks that had once warned victims to stay silent were being replaced by support systems that encouraged speaking out. The transformation hadn't been without challenges. 3 senior officers had requested transfers rather than work under the new protocols. A conservative veterans organization had launched a public campaign claiming that enhanced victim protections undermined military discipline. Senator Kensington continued to question our budget allocations and operational independence. But institutional momentum had shifted decisively in our favor. Young officers graduating from service academies now received mandatory training on sexual assault prevention and response. Senior enlisted personnel attended workshops on creating inclusive command climates. Even the Pentagon's executive floors had embraced changes that once seemed impossible. That evening, I drove to Arlington National Cemetery for a personal ritual I'd developed over the previous months. Walking among the white headstones, I thought about all the service members who died protecting ideals the institution itself had sometimes failed to uphold. Their sacrifice demanded that we do better, be better, create a military worthy of their dedication. My phone buzzed with a text from David. Dad wants to know if you're free for dinner Sunday. He's cooking. Professor James Chen, cooking dinner for his general daughter. The man who'd once dismissed my military career as unrealistic fantasy now followed defense news religiously, proudly sharing articles about our division's work with his academic colleagues. Our relationship had evolved from grudging acknowledgement to genuine respect, built on shared commitment to institutional improvement. The next morning brought news that would test everything we'd built. Major General Richards, commanding officer of Fort Braxton, had been arrested on multiple charges of sexual assault spanning 15 years. The case involved 17 victims, systematic cover-ups, and evidence that Richards had used his position to silence complaints and transfer potential witnesses. The magnitude of the scandal threatened to overshadow our progress, providing ammunition for critics who claimed that reform efforts weren't working fast enough. Media coverage focused on institutional failure rather than systemic change, with headlines questioning whether the military could ever truly police itself. I called an emergency staff meeting, gathering our senior personnel in the main conference room, where organizational charts and policy flow charts covered every wall. The mood was tense. Everyone understood that Richard's case would define public perception of our work. This is exactly why we exist, I reminded the assembled team. The old system would have protected Richards for another decade while his victims suffered in silence. Our protocols identified patterns, gathered evidence, and built a case that will finally bring him to justice. Colonel Washington displayed the investigation timeline on the main screen. Initial complaint filed through our anonymous reporting system. Independent investigation launched within 24 hours. Federal prosecutors brought in within a week. No command interference. No institutional protection. No cover-up. The contrast with historical cases was stark. Under previous protocols, Richard's victims would have faced retaliation, evidence would have disappeared, and command protection would have ensured the story never became public. Our system had worked exactly as designed, but success in this context meant exposing decades of institutional failure. Over the following weeks, I testified before Congress 3 more times, explaining how our reforms had enabled the Richards prosecution while acknowledging that similar cases had probably gone undetected for years. The testimony was difficult but necessary. Accountability required confronting uncomfortable truths about how many victims the military had failed to protect. The most challenging moment came during a closed session with the Senate Armed Services Committee, where classified details of the Richards investigation were discussed. 17 victims, spanning 3 different installations, multiple overseas deployments, and a pattern of abuse that had been reported, investigated, and dismissed repeatedly under the old system. General Chen, Senator Phillips asked during the classified briefing, how many more officers like Richards are still serving? The question haunted me because I couldn't answer it definitively. Our data suggested dozens of similar cases might exist, hidden within command structures that had protected perpetrators for decades. The Richards case wasn't an aberration. It was likely representative of systemic problems we were only beginning to uncover. That weekend, I drove to Sacramento to have dinner with my parents. The house felt smaller than I remembered, filled with academic books and research papers that represented my father's life's work. But the walls now also displayed framed newspaper articles about military reform, photos from the Pentagon ceremony, and a small flag that had flown over the Capitol in recognition of our division's achievements. "The Richards case must be difficult," my father said as we sat in his study after dinner. "All that progress, and then something like this happens." "Actually, Dad, it proves the system is working," I replied. Richards got away with his crimes for 15 years because nobody was willing to challenge command authority. Our reforms made it possible to finally hold him accountable. My father nodded thoughtfully, adjusting his reading glasses as he considered my words. In academic research, we talk about systemic versus symptomatic problems. Fixing symptoms makes things look better temporarily, but addressing systemic issues requires fundamental structural change. Exactly. Richards is a symptom. The system that protected him was the disease. We talked late into the evening about institutional change, research methodology, and the challenges of measuring progress when success often meant exposing previous failures. My father's analytical perspective helped clarify my own thinking about what we were trying to accomplish. Flying back to Washington the next morning, I reflected on how much had changed since that first phone call from Colonel Martinez. The scared woman hiding in corporate obscurity had been replaced by someone who understood that real leadership meant accepting responsibility for institutional transformation, even when that transformation revealed uncomfortable truths. The plane descended through clouds toward Reagan National Airport, the Pentagon's distinctive shape visible in the distance. Somewhere in that building, my staff was processing new cases, implementing updated protocols, and slowly changing a culture that had resisted accountability for generations. In 3 days, I had another congressional hearing scheduled. Next week, we were launching new training programs at 12 additional installations. Next month, I'd be presenting our annual report to senior defense leadership, documenting both successes and ongoing challenges. The work never ended, but that was the point. Institutional change wasn't a destination. It was a continuous process of improvement, accountability, and recommitment to values that had always existed in theory but were finally being implemented in practice. The uniform hanging in my Pentagon office no longer represented personal vindication or family drama. It represented responsibility for ensuring that other service members would never face the choice between their dignity and their dreams, never wonder whether speaking the truth would end their careers, never doubt that the institution would protect them instead of their predators. That was what wearing stars really meant, not the authority to command, but the obligation to serve something larger than yourself. 2 years after walking back into the Pentagon as a newly minted general, I stood before the Defense Secretary's conference table reviewing the most significant decision of my military career. The folder in front of me contained orders for promotion to Lieutenant General, 3 stars, and assignment as Deputy Chief of Staff for Personnel, one of the Army's most powerful positions. Secretary Harrison watched as I studied the documents that would elevate me to the highest levels of military leadership. "You've earned this, Rebecca. The personnel position will give you authority to implement reforms across all Army operations, not just justice issues." 3 stars. The promotion represented validation beyond anything I'd imagined possible during those dark years in corporate exile. But it also meant leaving the Military Justice Reform Division I'd built from nothing, trusting others to continue work that had become intensely personal. "The division will continue under Colonel Washington's leadership," Harrison continued, anticipating my concerns. "Your reforms are now embedded in military law, policy, and culture. They don't need you to survive anymore." That evening, I walked through the division's offices for what might be the last time as its director. The space had transformed from hastily converted storage rooms into a sophisticated operations center, with dedicated investigation teams, victim advocacy units, and training coordinators. Maps on the walls showed reform implementation across global military installations. Charts tracked case resolution statistics that would have been impossible under the old system. Captain Jennifer Brooks, one of our newest investigators, approached with a file in her hands. At 26, she represented the new generation of military officers who'd never known the broken system we'd replaced. To her, comprehensive victim protection and independent investigations were simply how things worked. "General, I wanted to thank you before the transition," she said. "I probably wouldn't be here without the changes you made. When I was assaulted during my first deployment, I reported it through your system. The investigation was thorough, fair, and the perpetrator was prosecuted. Under the old system, I would have left the military." Stories like Captain Brooks had become common, but they never lost their impact. Each case represented a life not destroyed, a career not ended, a dream not abandoned, because someone had finally made institutions accountable to the people they served. That weekend, my entire family gathered in Sacramento to celebrate my promotion. David's children, now old enough to understand their aunt's achievements, peppered me with questions about military life and leadership responsibilities. My mother bustled around the kitchen preparing enough food for a small army, her pride evident in every overflowing dish. My father had changed most dramatically over the 2 years since the Pentagon ceremony. The man who'd once dismissed military service as inferior to academic achievement now spoke knowledgeably about defense policy, strategic planning, and institutional reform. He'd even begun incorporating military case studies into his logistics courses, drawing connections between corporate supply chains and military operations. 3 stars, he said as we sat on the back porch after dinner, watching his grandchildren play in the yard. "When you were 8 years old and announced you wanted to be a general, I thought it was a childhood fantasy. I couldn't imagine how a girl from our family could achieve something like that." "I'm not sure I could imagine it either, back then," I admitted. "The path wasn't exactly what I expected." "Better, though, more meaningful," he paused, choosing his words carefully. "Your mother and I raised you to value education and intellectual achievement above everything else. We thought physical courage was less important than academic excellence. But watching what you've accomplished, seeing how you've used your position to protect others, I understand now that there are different kinds of intelligence, different ways to serve." The conversation continued as the Sacramento evening cooled around us, 2 people who'd spent decades misunderstanding each other finally finding common ground in shared respect for service, commitment, and the courage to challenge systems that needed changing. Monday morning brought my final division staff meeting as director. The conference room was packed with personnel I'd hired, trained, and mentored over the past 2 years. Many had become close friends as well as colleagues, united by shared mission and the satisfaction of meaningful work. Colonel Washington, soon to be promoted to Brigadier General herself, presented our final statistics. Sexual assault reports had increased by 300%, not because incidents were rising, but because victims finally trusted the system to protect them. Prosecution rates had doubled. Victim satisfaction surveys showed unprecedented confidence in military justice processes. More importantly, command climate assessments indicated fundamental cultural shifts. Young officers routinely challenged inappropriate behavior that previous generations had tolerated. Senior leaders attended training sessions they once would have delegated to subordinates. The toxic masculinity that had poisoned military culture for generations was slowly being replaced by professional standards that valued competence over conformity. "What we've built here will outlast all of us," I told the assembled team. "The policies are codified in law, the procedures are embedded in training, the culture has shifted permanently. Your work has ensured that no service member will ever again face the choice between dignity and duty." That afternoon, I cleaned out my office, packing photographs, awards, and personal items accumulated over 2 years of intensive institutional reform. The dress uniform hanging behind my door would move with me to new offices, new responsibilities, new challenges that came with 3-star authority. My final act as division director was reviewing a case file that had arrived that morning. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, a young soldier stationed in Germany, had reported sexual harassment by her platoon leader. Under our protocols, an independent investigation team was already en route, victim advocacy services had been activated, and command protection orders were in place. Reading through Santos's statement, I was struck by her confidence in the system, her certainty that reporting would lead to justice rather than retaliation. That confidence represented everything we'd worked to achieve. Institutional trustworthiness earned through consistent, fair, transparent processes. 3 days later, I stood in the Pentagon's main corridor, wearing 3 stars for the first time, headed to my first meeting as Deputy Chief of Staff for Personnel. The promotion had been covered extensively by military publications and mainstream media, most focusing on my unique path from resignation to senior leadership. But the real story wasn't personal vindication or family reconciliation. The real story was institutional transformation. The proof that even the most resistant organizations could change when led by people committed to something larger than their own advancement. The corridor bustled with morning activity, colonels heading to briefings, generals discussing policy, civilian officials managing the vast bureaucracy that supported military operations worldwide. I'd once been intimidated by this environment, convinced that someone like me could never belong among such senior leaders. Now I understood that leadership wasn't about belonging to exclusive circles or meeting traditional expectations. Leadership was about using whatever authority you'd earned to make things better for the people who came after you, ensuring that their paths would be clearer than yours had been. Walking into my new office, I found a package waiting on the desk. Inside was a framed photograph from the Pentagon ceremony 2 years earlier, the moment when my father had publicly acknowledged my achievements while I presented his award. Both of us in formal attire, both recognized for service to the country, both finally understanding that there were many ways to wear uniform with honor. The note attached was in my father's careful handwriting, for the general who proved that sometimes the best leaders are the ones who refuse to accept that things can't change. Wear those stars with pride, Rebecca. You've earned every one of them. 15 years after walking away from the military in disgrace, 20 years after my father declared I'd never wear the uniform again, I stood in the Pentagon, wearing 3 stars and carrying authority to shape policy for over 1 million soldiers worldwide. The dress blues that had hung in my closet like a funeral shroud had become a symbol of institutional transformation, personal resilience, and the power of refusing to accept that broken systems couldn't be fixed. My father had been wrong about almost everything regarding my military career, but he'd been right about one thing. I would never wear that uniform the same way again. I wore it better now, with the wisdom that comes from failure, the strength that comes from survival, and the purpose that comes from using your own pain to prevent others from suffering the same injustices. The little girl who dreamed of wearing stars had grown into the general who understood that stars weren't destinations. They were tools for building the future that others deserved. As I settled into my new office that first day, my assistant brought a stack of personnel files requiring immediate attention. Among them was a promotion recommendation for a young captain who'd been passed over twice despite exemplary performance. Reading through her record, I recognized the subtle patterns of discrimination that had once derailed my own career. Performance evaluations that mentioned personality conflicts without specifics, assignments to administrative roles despite combat leadership qualifications, commanders who questioned her command presence while praising identical traits in male peers. Under the old system, Captain Elizabeth Morgan would have quietly left the military, her potential wasted by institutional bias. But now I had the authority to intervene, to ensure her promotion moved forward, to mentor her through the challenges I'd once faced alone. That evening, I called Captain Morgan personally. Her surprise at receiving a call from a 3-star general was evident, but so was her determination to succeed, despite the obstacles she'd encountered. "Captain, your record shows exceptional leadership potential," I told her. "I want to discuss your career development and ensure you receive the assignments that will prepare you for senior leadership roles." Her gratitude reminded me why the stars on my shoulders mattered. They weren't symbols of personal achievement. They were instruments of institutional change, tools for opening doors that had been closed to people like us for too long. The dress uniform hanging in my office would be worn to many more ceremonies, meetings, and official functions. But its true power wasn't in the fabric or the insignia. It was in the promise it represented. A promise that the military would finally live up to its own ideals, that service members would be judged by their merit rather than their gender, and that speaking the truth would be rewarded rather than punished. My father had said I'd never wear that uniform again. He was right. I'd never wear it the same way. I wore it with the authority to ensure that other daughters, other dreamers, other young officers would find paths cleared by those who'd fought these battles before them. Looking for more? We've got two amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.